Now I would like to invite Sara Felici from the European Commission Joint Research Center to present a paper on the effect of the school closures on students' academic performance in Italy. The floor is for Sara.
So good afternoon everyone, my name is Sara Felici. I work for the Joint Research Center of the European Commission and I present today a study on the impact of school closures on students' academic performance in Italy. This is a joint work with my colleague Joseph Mestre. It's work in progress, so whatever comment you have is very appreciated. And also for INVALSI colleagues in the room, it's the first time we use INVALSI data, so even tips, tricks, whatever caveat we need to be aware of, please absolutely let me know. So full disclosure, yes, this is yet another college paper. I'm sure you've seen many in the last 2-3 years, so sorry about that, but we try something new. Hopefully we'll convince you, I will manage to convince you that there is something extra that we are trying to do to disentangle a specific effect, so hopefully it's still interesting to add to the existing literature. So the reference literature is still the one on the impact of the pandemic on students' performance. There are a few meta-analyses already on this topic, which highlight a sharp decline in general, but with changes that vary a lot between countries, depending on age groups, subject, reading or math, and also the measures taken in the country to contain the pandemic. Studies differ in the empirical strategies, so it's not easy to do comparison, but overall we see normally greater losses for schools who were closed for longer, educational inequalities by socioeconomic background and by initial skills increased, and there is no clear sign of recovery after the initial losses. So this study is on Italy. Italy was the first country to experience the outbreak of the pandemic in the EU and to impose a very strict national lockdown. It had one of the longest periods of school closures in the EU during the 2019-2020 school year, but also extensive limitations in the 2020-2021 school year. And this is actually what we are looking at the most. There are already a couple of papers on the impact of the COVID pandemic on students' performance in Italy as a whole, which is one study by Economi and Ferrara and one by Contini and co-authors. There is actually a second one by Contini and co-authors, but this is focusing on the province of Turin, so it's a very local study if you want. The other two are on primary and lower secondary for Economi and Ferrara and upper secondary for Contini and co-authors. What they find is, for secondary education, always substantial reductions in both reading and math. In primary school, they find an increase for reading in the Ferrara paper and a small decrease for math. They find relatively lower reduction for girls, increased gaps for low achieving students, and stable socioeconomic inequalities in achievement. Now, what most empirical studies in the literature do is actually to look at the overall impact of the pandemic. What they do is to use pre-COVID cohorts as controls for the COVID ones. So it's always a comparison between different cohorts of students. So they use the change in academic performance between two different grades of two cohorts, the pre-COVID cohort as a control for the COVID one. Our approach is a bit different. We try to isolate the effect of physical school closures rather than the pandemic overall. And we maintain we can do this because our controls also belong to the COVID cohort. So we don't use pre-COVID and COVID cohort, but different groups of students within the COVID cohort. We do this by exploiting the heterogeneity in containment measures that was implemented in the country in school year 2020-2021 across grades and across regions to identify controls. Now, this academic year in Italy was characterized by a combination of in-person and online or hybrid learning. Which of the two regimes was in place depending on two factors. The first was the local risk level in the region. Can I ask how many are from Italy or Italian or living in Italy at the time of the pandemic? Okay, so many were not. This was a quite entertaining period in our life, I think, in Italy, because the level of restrictions that were applied in the region varied basically on a weekly level based on a set of indicators defined by the government that were capturing the epidemiological risk, local risk, the stress under which the health system was, so how full the hospitals were, and so on. So based on a set of 20 or 21 indicators, every week the government was deciding under which risk level each region was falling. And this was based on a 4-category scale, based on colors. So basically we had white, yellow, orange, and red. White was the lowest levels of restrictions. The others were in between, up to the highest, which was red. I come from Lombardy, which was one of those that experienced the strongest restrictions because it was for a good amount of time in this red region. So just to say, this is the share of days in each color zone for each region between November 2020, which is when the government set up this new way to define restrictions, until June 2021. The second factor is school grade. And this is because normally primary school students were allowed to be doing schooling in person, so they were going to the classroom. While high school students were always between hybrid and online, depending on the color of the region, but still they were more likely to be in this type of schooling format. Lower secondary were online only in red zones. This is a table that tries to give an overview of the schooling formats that were applied over time. So these are the different decrees by the Italian government that were establishing that for each zone in these periods, for each grade, which is the format that was applied. So basically we see that in high school, so grades 9 to 13, mostly during this period it was between e-learning and hybrid. Hybrid meaning there were shifts, basically there were shifts between classmates, so a share of the class was going 1 week and another share in the next week. So these are basically the most treated, if you want, because these were really those exposed to closure, physical school closures. On the other hand, primary schools, always in person, if not for very specific periods like around Easter, because they know that then people meet for Easter and therefore they try to contain a bit the spread of the virus, but for the rest they were in person. Grade 7 and 8 were something in between. But they were mostly in person, so they were doing e-learning only in specific periods in red zones, but for the rest they were going in person. So this is more or less the setup in Italy during this year. So what we try to use is exactly this assignment of schooling formats based on the color of the region and the grade. So students are assigned to different formats based on a variable which is actually observable because grade is clearly observable. And this is what defines treatment in our setup. There is also heterogeneity in local risk level in this color system, so there is also an intensity of treatment if you want, because maybe some regions were more often than others in red or stricter containment measures. What we use is the difference in difference estimation. Basically, this is exactly what Professor Rettore was saying in the morning. So we use diff in diff, using INVALSI data, and we compare difference in standardized test scores of students exposed to online schooling mandates with those who were not, before and after the introduction of these mandates. Just to recap, what we try to identify is the impact of online hybrid learning versus what the other studies do, which is the impact of learning during the pandemic, so an overall impact of the pandemic. The difference in the approach is this one. Basically, so what you see on the left is what the other studies of Italy, but on most other countries, are doing. So the treated is the cohort that takes the test in 2021, checking the difference between the previous test that they took, which was pre-pandemic. So in Italy, given the type of data, you will have this treated cohort observed in 2018. The control is a pre-COVID cohort, so the test that for the same grade was taken in 2019 with baseline, so the previous score being the one 3 years before. What we do is to have treated and control within the same year, because our treated and controls are different grades. Advantages and disadvantages of our approach. So, the advantage is that we compare groups that coexisted in the same period. So they were all exposed to COVID, all exposed to all the distortions generated by the pandemic, all the relative policies, all the restrictions in social interactions, risk of contagion, but also the economic impact on the family, like a job loss of the parents and so on. It also kind of reduces the possibility that the effects we see are driven by compositional differences across groups. Say, for example, just to give an example, that there are more migrants in more recent years, this we would be able to control a bit better, not just by having controls, but because we assume the composition is similar in the same year. And there is another advantage, which is adding further school years, because I will show you in a bit, but for the other studies it is difficult to add further years because of the structure of INVALSI data. The disadvantage is obviously that groups are very different in age in the schools they attend, so one might say they are not really comparable. Okay, so we will try to see this. The common limitation is that there is no possibility to test the parallel difference. Why? Okay, so we use INVALSI data for grades 5, 8, and 13. So 13 is our treated. This is high school, so treated. Grade 5 is the control, not treated, but also grade 8. INVALSI data are comparable over time only from 18 or 19, depending on the grade, which means that everything that happened before is not necessarily comparable over time. So there is no way in the data to check many years before and see whether the evolution was different. This is because basically everything you see from here down, the same grade, same score, is not comparable to what comes after. So and this is a common limitation. This is something we cannot really do much about. What we try to do, just to to do a bit of homework and try to find alternatives, is also based on some other studies. So we look at other data. So we look at international large-scale assessment data, TIMSS, PIRLS, and PISA, and we try to see whether there were trends observed in the past, and we don't find so many. I mean, it's a bit difficult because tests are not done every year, they're not done at all grades, so it's a bit sparse, right? It's kind of difficult to do a precise exercise. But basically, when you see a full symbol, it means that it's statistically different from the previous one, and most of them are not. So we hope this is a way to show that there were no clear trends before the 2019. So our empirical strategy is a diff in diff. Our dependent variable is a standardized test in math or reading. And we have so grade takes value of 1 for students in school grade 13, which is the treated one, and 0 for the other ones, which are the untreated ones. We use province by time fixed effects, and we control for these variables that you see here. So these are descriptives. Here you see scores for grade 13 and 5 over time. This is not very clear maybe, but e-learning means grade 13 and in-person is grade 5. So you see a decrease in grade 13 in reading. So this is reading, this is math. You actually see a small increase in reading for grade 5, which is something that is found in INVALSI data. For math, both are decreasing actually. This is the result of the diff in diff, and we see in 2021 a decrease by 0.4 standard deviation. So what you see here is expressed in standard deviations. And it goes up a bit, 0.2 minus 0.2 in 2020. You see a similar pattern for math, but a bit better, so the drop is a bit lower. We do the same thing by gender, and we see that males are doing a bit worse than females. The literature finds explanations in terms of girls being better at self-motivation, self-discipline, things like this. So this is one of the possible explanations. By socioeconomic status. Here, there are not so many differences, which is kind of in line with the other literature in Italy. You see just a tiny lower performance for the first level, so for the lowest economic, social, and cultural status, which is actually widening a bit in 2022. When we look by origin, foreign students are doing a bit worse than natives. We also look at previous achievement, and this is the achievement 3 years before that is found in the data. And we see that the lower performers are actually doing a bit worse than the high performers, but there is something else happening in 2022 for math, where actually two are reversing somehow. We do the same exercise by looking not at grade 13 treated and 5 control, but 13 treated and 8 control. Again, I showed that 8 is a bit treated, but not too much. But at the same time, 8 feels a bit closer to 13 in terms of course, as age, but maybe also in terms of how to handle, how to cope with the pandemic, with the restrictions, and so on. So maybe in a way they're more comparable to grade 13 than 8-5. We see no improvement in reading in the post-COVID year. We see declines, but the declines are still stronger for grade 13. If we do the diff in diff, this is what we see. The drop is smaller than before, and there is a bit of recovery, but not too much, to be honest. When we go into the genders, the results are similar, apart from a bit in 2022 for math. When we go into the other disaggregations, results are a bit different when we do 13 versus 8 or 13 versus 5. We're not entirely sure why. I think we need to dig a bit deeper in this part of analysis, because what we see is actually that for the lowest economic, social, and cultural status, in 2021 the performance is a bit better for this group than for the highest socioeconomic background people. There is a bit of reversing of this trend in 2022, and this is also what we see for math. Same for origin. So here we find that natives are those doing a bit worse than foreigners. And same for previous achievement. So this is actually very different when we look at grade 8 as a control rather than grade 15. We also try to go a bit into the intensity issue. So we look at the percentage of time, we look at whether the individual is in a region which has been in red zones for more than the average. So it's a 1-0, it's a dummy, but this is the first attempt we do. And what we see there is that in 2021, being in grade 13 in a red zone is normally associated with a small but further drop in performance. So conclusion so far, there is a substantial drop in performance in both reading and math. We see that males, low achievers, and non-natives are more effective in the first specification, but in the second actually no, so I think we really need to dig a bit deeper in this sense. Next steps are further robustness checks. We did a few actually that I didn't show. For example, we consider only students that were on track because there was a change in the retention policy in Italy during COVID, so we tried to check for the selection of the students we have. but we plan to use also other type of data. For example, we use population data. We would like to try also with sample data from INVALSI, which is, let's say, maybe more corrected for cheating, if you want, in the sense that these are tests done in classrooms with external evaluators, external teachers, so not the teachers of the students taking the test. And we are working on adding school year 22-23 because we would like to look further into recovery. And this is one of the advantages of this methodology, of this approach that we adopt, because this really allows us to go further in time, even though as we go further in time, the same grade means something else, because the same grade, one person that is in grade 13 in 2023 was in grade 10 in 2020, so the exposure to the school closures, so the different teaching formats, was different, so we need to be a bit careful not to go too much in time in this sense. We would like to look into mechanisms for, so here, let's say here, based on what the rhetoric was in the morning, we try to see whether it's happening or not, but we would like to see why, what is behind this, so we hope to go into the students and teachers survey to understand the mechanisms a bit better, and maybe also using municipality level information to look into restrictions in schooling that were changing at the local level, because some municipalities were implementing further restrictions, so we hope to use these mechanisms. And that's it. Thanks a lot.